This month we're doing the A block, which is the album block. We're actually going to make 5 of those. And these are the fabrics for that block. And then we're also going to make the U block, which is the union square. And these are the fabrics for that. My colors are a little bit different on the union block, so I will talk about that when we start to cut. For the A block, we're going to divide the fabrics we have into 5 groups of 3. They're actually in your kit together like this. I did choose them so that it was kind of a purple block, a blue block, a green block, a gold block, a pink block. You don't have to do that. Feel free to mix them up. If you want to mix them up, you do need one that will be the light in the block, and the other two should be your medium and or dark. So that's up to you. I have already spray starched all of these and pressed them dry, so now we're ready to start cutting. The first piece we're going to cut is going to be what we're using for the center of our block. So go ahead and choose which ones you want to be the center. I did not use any of my lights for the center. Those are going to be the triangles that go around the center square. Our center of our block is a square and a square unit. So I intend to use the square squared ruler. However, I think I confused some people the last time we used the square squared ruler when they didn't buy the ruler. So I'm going to do one block not using the square squared ruler so you can see how to do it if you chose not to buy that ruler. I will do the rest of them with the square squared ruler, so I'm going to show both ways. We're going to start pretty much as I always do by getting 2 straight edges, and I call that clean cutting. So I cut 2 edges off. And then out of this corner where we have our 2 straight edges, I want a 1 7/8 inch square. So I'm going to line up on this ruler. It's the line just before the 2-inch mark, so 1 7/8. And the reason that I prefer the square squared ruler is because it's easier to get the exact size square that you need than trying to measure it. So there's my center, and out of this piece of fabric I also need 2 pieces that are 1 1/4 by 3 inches. So I'm going to go ahead and cut. I gave you a little extra here, it looks like. I need it to be 3 inches long, and 1 1/4 times 2 is 2 1/2. So I want 3 by 2 1/2. So you do have some extra over here if you miscut. I know some of you have said that this is just to get you in to buy more fabric. You really should, if you're careful, be able to always get your blocks out of the fabric in the kit. Then we're going to cut this in half so that I have my 2 1 1/4 inch strips. And that's my centerpiece. This is how I'm cutting if I'm not using the square squared ruler. For my other medium or dark for the block, I'm going to cut all of them this way, whether I'm using the square and a square ruler or not. So again, I'm going to clean cut 2 edges. And then from this piece, I need a rectangle that is 3 by 2 1/2. So I'm going to line my 3-inch line up here and my 2 1/2 here. I'm going to go ahead and cut this way first. I need to go change my blade. So there's my 3 by 2 1/2. I'm going to set that one aside, and then we again need 1 1/4 wide by 2 1/2 long. So 1 1/4 times 2 is 2 1/2. Whoops, it didn't need to be 3 inches long, but it doesn't. I'll just cut that down. We only need these to be 2 1/2, not 3 like our previous one. So 2.5 by 2.5 is what we're starting with, is a square. And then back our ruler up to 1 1/4. If you remember from before, if we're using our squared ruler, there is a chart over here that tells us how big to cut the squares and then cut them in half on the diagonal. We are making a 2-inch finished square and a square block, so it says cut them at 2 1/4, our squares. The pattern has us cut them at 2.5. You could cut them at either. With the 2.5, you're going to have a little bit more leeway for cutting down, so it's up to you. From our light fabric in our set, all we need is either 2.5 or 2 1/4 inch squares. I'm going to go ahead and just cut them 2.5 because it gives me a little bit more wiggle room. And you have plenty of fabric, so 2.5 times 2 is 5. So I'm just going to cut a 2.5 inch by 5 inch rectangle. And then I'm going to cut that in half, so back your ruler up to 2.5. Just like I always say, keep a line on at least 2 sides if you can when you're cutting, or 3. We can do that here. So 2.5 or 2 1/4, it's up to you. And then we're going to cut them in half on the diagonal, both of them, so we end up with 4 triangles. And those are the pieces you're going to need for each of the 5 blocks. So I'm not going to cut all of them for you on camera. I will cut one more centerpiece using the squared ruler, but all the rest of them are exactly the same. I'm going to go ahead and cut one more center using my squared ruler. So this is what I'm using for the pink. And between my last take on the cut and this one, I changed my blade, so what a difference. I'm going to go ahead and cut this time my 2 1 1/4 by 3 inch strips. So 1 1/4 times 2 is 2.5. And I'm just going to go ahead and cut the whole thing off of there. And then I'm going to move up, line up my 3 inch mark, keep my 2.5 inch mark here, cut, and move my ruler back to 1 1/4 and cut. So those are my 2 small rectangles. And then I'm going to switch to my squared ruler. And remember, it is marked for whatever size finished square and a square block you're making. So we are making a 2-inch finish, so I'm going to use this line to cut my square. So I'm just going to line it up with my clean cut edge and cut my square. So now go ahead and cut all your pieces. Your light is going to be your triangles, and then you can choose which medium or dark you want to be your center. Okay, I'm playing around a little bit. I already cut my rectangles off of this piece of fabric. This is going to be my center on my kind of purpley gray block. If you will remember, a square block sits on point. So if I cut this here, then my square is going to be running diagonal this way. So I'm going to play, there's enough fabric here to do that. I'm going to cut my center square on point. So what I'm doing is I'm lining up my point here and here with this stripe. Oops, sorry. And cut. And then I'm going to rotate it and cut here. And all that does for me is it makes that stripe either go vertical or horizontal depending on how I set the block. through it. So it'll sit like this. I'll make mine vertical. Just remember, if you choose to do this, you now have bias on this edge and this edge. You can do the same thing with a regular ruler. It's just a little bit easier to see with the squared ruler. With our 2.5 inch or 2.25 inch squares that we're cutting into triangles, you actually have two pieces that have a really light stripe in them. And if you don't care which way the stripes go, then just cut your angle any direction going on the from point to point. So I could go point to point, point to point. If I do that, I can't get my stripes all going the same direction in the block. So if you would like your stripes to all go in the same direction, we're going to cut point to point, point to point. So make a V or a mountain. You can do it the other way. Just don't cut them both the same direction. So this is what I mean. I have just cut my two squares from the rectangle, so the stripes are still going the same way. And I'm going to go point to point on this one, this direction, and then I'm going to swing around and go the opposite direction on the other one, point to point. Now, I think the stripe is strong enough that if I lay this out, you'll be able to see. So I want this piece and this piece. You'll have to pay attention when you're sewing them together too. You can't just sew them on willy-nilly. To go there, and this piece goes here, and this piece goes here, and that way my stripes are all traveling the same direction on the block. You don't have to do that. You can just make it look scrappy if you want to. It's just the weird things that I think about. Now we're going to start sewing together our square and square units, and the sewing is exactly the same way, whether I cut my 1 7/8 inch square or whether I cut my square using the square squared unit. So we're going to sew on opposite sides first, and if you remember from before, we're just going to center these triangles. It doesn't have to be exact because we're going to be trimming them down. When you sew though, we're going to sew from the square side, especially if you use the square squared ruler, because that square is the accurate piece. So we're going to do our 1/4 inch sewing with the square on top. Now, remember, we cut these stripes, or I cut these stripes, maybe you didn't, so that they would all go the same direction on the block. So you need to pay attention at this point when you're putting your triangles on, because you can still mess it up. This is how it should look. My stripes are all going that way. If I had put this piece on, then I've got them going this way and this way. And when I go add another one, it's just, they're going to be going two different directions. So it's up to you if you care about that. Here are my 5 units at this point. Once I sewed them, I pressed toward the triangles. So now we're ready to add our other sides on. So let's just work with these two. We're going to do this exactly the same way. The square is going to be on top. We are not worrying about cutting off those ears yet. We're just going to center that on the triangle and sew across. If you got your stripey one on the right way on the first two, you can't mess up now. And if you cut them the way I did, the other two will automatically go the direction they're supposed to. Here are all my square and a square units ready to be trimmed down. Remember, they are all oversized. So I'm going to trim the first one as if I did not own a square squared ruler. This is going to finish at 2 inches, which means we need to trim it to 2.5 to leave our 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way around. So half of 2.5 is 1 1/4. So I am going to line my 1 1/4 mark up, hopefully going across here and going down here, because that keeps everything centered. Now the next thing I want to do is be sure that I have the 1/4 inch mark right on the first 2 corners that I am going to trim, or as close as I can get them. That's good enough. And then I'm going to cut 2 sides. Okay. And now I'm committed on where my edges are going to be pretty much, unless I had oversized that. So now I'm lining my 2.5 inch mark up here and here. I should still have a 1/4 beyond here and here. I actually have a little bit more. That's because to get your perfect size center square on a square and a square unit, It's not going to be an 1/8 inch mark, but it's really hard to cut it any other size. But that'll work pretty well. So that's how I trim it if I do not have my squared ruler. If you do, we're going to take our ruler, and down on the end that has the crosshatch marks, and we've talked about this before, but there they are. These little marks in here are going to line up with my corners on the square that's in the middle. And maybe a different color will work better here. I don't know. Let's try the light one. Yeah, you can probably see that one best. So I'm going to line up the little 2-inch crosshatch marks the best I can, and it's pretty good. And I'm going to cut off the first 2 edges. And again, I'm pretty much committed now, so I'm going to line up my 2-inch mark on my 2 sides that I already cut. But if I was accurate, my crosshatch mark should still be on my corners. And cut. And cut. Not sure, but I'm at a weird angle here. So trim all of them down. It just depends on which way you were doing your center, whether you're using your squared ruler or whether you were using a regular ruler. Our next step is to sew a 1 1/4 by 3 inch strip to each side of our 2 1/2 by 3 inch rectangle. So the 3 inches match up. And then once we sew them, we are going to press the seams in toward the center. Here are all my sections sewn together, and the seams are pressed toward the center. So now we are going to cut 2 strips from these that are 1 1/4 inches wide. So remember, we have 3 inches going this way, so we have a little bit of wiggle room. Again, I am going to line up my ruler, and I like to line a line up with the seams so that I make sure everything's going to be straight. I'm going to cut and rotate, and 1 1/4 times 2 is 2 1/2. So I'm going to go ahead and cut 2 1/2 inch strips. I'm lining up my 2 1/2 inch line here. Again, I am lining up lines with my seams if I possibly can. I'm going to cut and back off to 1 1/4. So my 1 1/4 is here, and again I have lines with the seams because that just keeps all those pieces straight. So we're going to cut all 5 of those just like that. Next, we're going to take our 1 1/4 by 2 1/2 inch rectangles and sew them onto opposite sides of our square and a square unit. I will be sewing with my square and a square unit on top so that I can see that intersection right there. Hopefully. It's where the threads cross and hit that point exactly. Here we are so far. I did press the seams away from the center this time, or away from the square and a square unit. So our last step is on these blocks is going to be take those 2 strips that we cut previously, and they're going to go on the other 2 sides of our square and a square unit. And again, I'm going to be sewing with this on top so that I can see my intersection on the point in the square and a square. Our seams are pressed in opposite directions, so they will nest when we go to sew. Here are my 5 finished album blocks, and my last pressing was also toward the outside, so away from the center. I wanted to show you just real quick why I prefer using the squared ruler. Let's go way in on this. This is the block that I made without the squared ruler, and it's fine. But if your goal is to be as perfect as possible, it's not there. Remember, I could trim my first 2 edges and get exactly that 1/4 inch from my point, so those 2 are hitting exactly where they should. But my last 2 edges, I had to go with my 2 1/2 inch square, and you can see my point doesn't come all the way out to the frame. The reason for that is cutting to your nearest 1/8 inch when you're doing the center on a square and a square unit is not going to get you as precise a square. The square and a square block, or the squared block, has the precision sizes for my center squares. So you see my points come all the way out to the frame all the way around. If I'm just making a quilt for fun, I'm fine with the green. If I'm making it for a show, then it's going to matter whether my points go to where they belong. The Union Square block, these are my fabrics, and here's how they go with what it says on the pattern. Mine are a little bit different. This is our pink square. The pattern says it's 3.5 inches. This is closer to 5.5 because I want you to be able to fussy cut and choose where you want the center of the block to be. This is our 3.5 by 6.5. It should be slightly larger than that rectangle, and it says it's a beige print. It is beige, but this one has sort of dots on it, and it mentions dots later. So this is our first one, the smaller one. Then this is our green rectangle. And then this says it's a beige dot. You do not have dots for this piece. You have a floral piece. And finally, it says a navy print, and it has 2 different pieces in there because they apparently miscut when they first made the kits. You only have 1 piece, and it is not navy. It is red. But you will be able to get all your pieces out of this. From our pink piece, we are going to cut a square that is 3 inches. And I gave you oversized because you can decide whether you want this part to be in the middle or whether you want the stripe to be in the middle. Half of 3 inches is 1.5. So if I wanted this to be in the center, I would put my 1.5 inch mark on the ruler running right up the middle of that. If I wanted my stripe to be in the center, again, I would put my 1.5 inch mark right up the center of it. And this is big enough that you can play with it and decide where you want it to be. I think I'm going to go ahead and make the vines the center. So I'm putting my 1.5 in the middle, and then I'm looking beyond that outside stripe. I have a little over 1/4 inch. I have a little over 1/4 inch there. So I can play with where it's going to be as well. Some parts of the fabric may be straighter than others, especially after you've pressed. So mine's straighter up here on the top. So again, I have my 1.5 in the middle. I'm checking over on the edges. I've got a 1/4 inch beyond that light brown line. I've got about a 1/4 inch beyond it here. So this is where I'm going to cut. So a 3 inch square. Rotate and line up my 3 inches with my 2 clean cut edges and a 3 inch square. So now when I go to put this in the center, my vines will be the center of that block. So that's what fussy cutting is. It's being choosy about where you're cutting for the pattern. The next piece we're cutting is what she's calling the beige print. Ours has kind of large dots or almost asterisks in them. From that, we're going to cut 2 3 inch squares. So, as usual, I am clean cutting 2 edges. I'm going to rotate. 3 times 2 is 6 inches. So I'm lining up my 3 inch on the long and my 6 on the short and cutting. And then I'm backing off to my 3 inch mark, making sure I have a line over along my long edge as well, and cut. And those 2 squares we are going to cut in half into 2 triangles. Go. From my green piece, I need to cut 2 3 3/4 inch squares. So we're going to clean cut 2 edges. So let's write the and 3 3/4 times 2 is 7.5. So we're going to line up our 3 3/4 mark and our 7.5 mark. And we're going to cut. And we are going to back off to 3 3/4 and cut. And we want to cut these in half to make them into half square triangles. Just like in the last block, this one's kind of a directional, almost a stripe. So that I can get it all going the same direction, because it is going around a center, I'm going to do the same thing I did last time, where I cut one way and then back down the other way. So I'm either making a wide V or mountaintop, just depending on which way you look at it. If you don't care if they all go the same direction, it doesn't matter. So there's my 4 triangles. From our large beige rectangle, which the pattern is calling a beige dot, but ours is a floral, we need to cut 6 different squares. One is 5 inches, one is 4 1/2 inches, and 4 of them are 1 3/4 inches. So this is a little bit longer piece. I'm going to a longer ruler. I am going to once again clean cut 2 edges. And remember, I've been rotating my fabric, but if you don't want to move it out of square, you can always rotate your mat if you're using a small enough mat. And then, rather than cutting it down to a specific width, I'm going to start by just cutting a 5-inch strip off of this end. So I'm lining my 5-inch mark up with the short edge, and with my clean cut edge, I'm lining another line up. I'm going to cut, move that out of the way, and now I'm going to trim this down to a 5-inch square. So I need my 5-inch here on the long edge, cut that piece off. I'm going to move that out of the way. Now my next square is 4 1/2 inches, so I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to cut off a 4 1/2 inch strip. So I'm lining my 4 1/2 inch line up with the short edge, and then a line with the side that I clean cut. Move that out of the way. We're going to back up to 4 1/2 inches and cut. And then what's left, I need 4 1 3/4 inch squares. So 1 3/4 times 2 is 3 1/2. So I'm going to cut a 3 1/2 inch square. And here and here. And then I'm going to move to 1 3/4 one way. And if I don't move this, I can line up my 1 3/4 the other direction too, and cut those 4 squares. We are using red, but the pattern is calling it navy. From this, we need 1 5-inch square and 4 2 1/2 inch squares. You have way more than enough fabric, because I saw where they had you cut 2 pieces for the kit because they messed up. So I put it all in one. So you have more than enough. I'm going to just rotate my mat again, like I did the last time. And I'm going to cut my 5-inch square or strip off of this end. Remember, I have a clean cut edge here and here. So I'm lining my 5-inch line up with the end, cutting, and then cutting again. And then out of what's left, I need 4 2 1/2 inch squares. So I'm going to need another 5-inch strip off of here, because 2 1/2 times 2 is 5. So I'm going to cut another 5-inch square. And here. Then we're going to back up to the 2 1/2 inch mark. And cut. If you're careful and don't move it, then you can move your 2 1/2 inch up the other direction and cut. And even with a new blade, I didn't press hard enough. I'm so used to having to press really hard when it's not sharp. So those are the squares I need out of the red. On the wrong side of all of our small red squares, you can either draw one line on the diagonal like this, or you can use your magic wand and put it, remember the line goes on opposite corners, and then you draw on both sides of it. Can't remember whether I've shown you this before or not, but when you're drawing on fabric, a sandpaper board can make your life easier. This is a commercially purchased one. However, you can make one out of fine grit sandpaper, just glue it onto a board. And if you saw how it was wiggling when I was drawing just on the mat, you can see how it's gripping on the sandpaper board, not moving around quite as much. So on this one, I'll just draw the diagonal line, single one. So take your pick, whichever method you like better. We have done this before. We are making flying geese units, and we've done that before. So we're going to take our 4.5 inch beige, what she's calling a dot, but we're using a floral, and put our red squares on top, 2 of them, matching our sides and our corner. And then we're going to put one in the opposite corner, doing exactly the same thing, matching the sides and the corner. So if you drew a single line, you're going to stitch 1/4 inch away from that line on both sides. If you drew a double line, you are going to stitch on that double line. Here's my piece stitched, and now we're just going to cut it in half, right through the middle, from corner to corner between our stitching. Then I'm going to take it and press it toward the red. Now we take our other 2 red squares and again match up our point and our 2 edges on both of them. And if you had 1 line, you're going to sew on both sides of the line. If you mark 2 lines, sew on the line. After sewing, once again, we are going to cut it in half between our stitching lines, and then we will press toward the red again. So we end up with flying geese units like this. We need to trim these down to 3 inches wide by 1 3/4 high. We need 1/4 inch above the point. And mine came out with a little less than 1/4 on this side. I am not going to redo them. I am going to compensate for that. So this is what I'm doing. Half of 3 inches is 1 1/2. So I'm putting my 1/4 inch mark at 1 1/2 right there on the center. So I have a little bit to trim on this side, and I'm a little bit shy on this side. I'm also looking down here at the 1 3/4 inch mark. I would like it to be running right into the red. It should be right where the cream and the red are meeting. So when you have it as close as you can get it, we're going to trim our first 2 sides. Going to rotate, and I want the one that was high enough. That's where I'm going to line up my 1 3/4 for the width, and I'm putting the 3 inch on my short side. I still want that 1/4 inch mark to be there, so you can see I'm just a little bit off up there. I can also put my 45-degree line, I can line it up either parallel or right on the seam. If you want, it'll help keep everything straight and lined up. When I'm as close as I can get it, then go ahead and trim. So all of them are going to be 3 by 1 3/4 high. So just showed you how you can compensate, because I'm not always perfect, even though a lot of you seem to think so. On the wrong side of the 5 inch beige square, you can either mark a line point to point like this, or you could line up your magic wand, the line going point to point, a mark on both sides. You want to do it both directions on this. Okay, now we're going to layer that beige square that we just marked on top of our 5 inch red square, and we're going to put right sides together, and we're going to take it to the sewing machine and sew 1/4 inch from that center line on both sides of the line, both directions, Or if you marked it with 2 lines, you're going to sew on the lines on both directions. I've sewn both directions on both sides of my line. Now we're going to cut this like you would cut a pie or a pizza, and we're going to cut it into 8 pieces. So first I'm going to cut in a plus mark, and then I will cut on the lines. So this was a 5-inch square, so I want to cut right through the middle. Half of 5 inches is 2.5, so that should put me right through the center. And then I'm going to go the other direction. Again, 2.5 inches should put me right through the center. And the reason I did the plus or that mark first is because now if they get separated, it's not a big deal. I'm cutting between my 2 stitching lines. In fact, I'm going to separate them. So point to point or on the line that you drew. There we go. And now I'm going to open those up and I'm going to press. It doesn't tell you which way. I'm going to press toward the red because it's the darker. So I end up with 8 half square triangle units with that method. So I'll go press and then we're going to trim them down. I've pressed this and the pattern actually did say we're to press toward the dark. Now I need to trim it down. So the way I'm trimming, I am using a square ruler. Most square rulers have a 45-degree line through them. If it does, it's helpful. I am lining the point up or my 45-degree line on my seam. I'm trimming these to 1 3/4, so I want to make sure I'm going to have 1 3/4. And then I'm going to clean cut my first 2 edges. So I'm going to show you this with the regular ruler first, and then I'm going to show you another nifty tool. So now that I have trimmed to have 2 edges clean, I'm lining up my 1 3/4 inch mark with my 2 straight edges, and I am still putting my 45-degree line there on the seam so that everything stays straight. And trim. So all of them are going to be trimmed down to that size, and you can certainly trim them all that way with just a regular ruler. This is a block lock ruler, and it is made especially for trimming down half square triangle units. It has a groove cut into the back that rides right along that seam when it's pressed to one side. It does come in several different sizes. Somewhere a medium size is what I like because I can cut smaller pieces with it. I would probably have chosen a 4-inch if I hadn't been buying this for a specific project, because I rarely cut bigger half square triangle units. So the way it works is I get my piece that needs to be trimmed down, and the groove rides right along it. Now, just be aware, I want my point to line up with my seam because it will ride on it the other way, but if I trim it that way, my point is not on my seam. So pay attention to that. Let me zoom in. Okay, so again, the first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to get that groove on there, and it just rides right back and forth on the seam. And I need to clean cut 2 edges just like I did before. Again, I want to make sure that it's going to have enough to trim it down to the 1 3/4. I'm going to trim, and I don't have to turn my ruler. I can just put my fingers down on this, swirl it around, and the ruler is marked the same way on the other side. So I can just slide it down, and I'm going to slide to my 1 3/4 marks right here and cut. Now, if you're only ever going to trim half square triangle units for this pattern, don't bother getting it. But if you are going to be trimming them for lots of other projects, I think it's worth the money. I was skeptical at first, but the more I use it, the better I like it. So let me just trim a few and show you how quick it can be. So, riding on the ridge, cut, cut, twist, slide back, don't have to try to line up that 45-degree line with my regular ruler. But you do need to pay attention to make sure you're getting that point on the seam. If you don't, you'll have a really weird looking square. Twist, slide back, 1 3/4. Again, that's the most important thing. Get that point in the right place to start, and life will be good. Slide back, 1 3/4, and cut. Oops, didn't get it that time. Doesn't matter if you don't. You can just put it right back on and cut. And I think that's all 8, all trimmed up and ready to go. We're ready to start putting our block together. And to start, we're doing a square and a square unit. And you may say, why aren't you using the square squared ruler? Well, the reason is the square squared ruler only makes whole numbered finished blocks. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6. This is not going to finish at any of those numbers, so we had to go the other way. So I'm going to sew my triangles on opposite sides. I pressed toward the triangles, and now we are ready to put triangles on the 2 remaining edges of our center, exactly the same way. Okay, here's my square and a square unit. We want to trim this down to 4 inches. Half of 4 is 2, so I'm lining my 2-inch mark up both directions with the points. I'm going this way, and I would like the 1/4-inch mark to be on my points, and this one's actually coming out pretty good. So once I'm reasonably certain I have my 1/4-inch mark here and here on the points, and my 2 is running through both ways, I'm going to trim 2 sides. Then I'm going to rotate, line up my 4-inch mark, and again the 2s should be going through. Trim, trim. We're not finished with that. We are going to make it a square and a square and a square. So now we're going to take our green pieces. Now remember, they were directional. So pay attention to how you're putting them on here. See, that's wrong. That's right, if I want to keep everything running the same direction. So that's all right. So 2 opposite sides to start. And I will sew with this on top so I can try to hit my point right there. The triangles are oversized. We'll be trimming down, so all you have to do is visually center. Put my 2 sides on. I pressed again toward the triangle. And I'm going to put my 2 remaining triangles on, and I will again press toward the triangle. I once again pressed toward the triangles. Now we're ready to trim this down to 5 1/2. Half of 5 1/2 is 2 3/4. So I'm lining my 2 3/4 mark up, going through the points, both directions. And I want it to be 5 1/2. And I can see that my points aren't going to come out exactly, just like when I showed you in the last time. So rather than having 2 of them come out right and 2 of them wrong, I'm going to kind of split the difference. So I'm just a hair more than 1/4 beyond that point. Same thing here, same thing here, same thing here. Because I'd rather have it floating than one hitting the point and one not. So when you've got it how you want it, trim 2 sides. Then we're going to rotate and line up the 5 1/2-inch mark. And trim and trim. Okay. So now we're going to turn this into a star. To do that, we are going to use our flying geese units. They're here, and our half square triangle units here and here. We're going to make 2 rows like this, one for the top and one for the bottom. And wrong. Pay attention to your direction, especially when you sit down at the sewing machine. There. And there. Now remember, I was compensating on my flying geese units. So I know that one side is a little bit too narrow, but I did have it straight on the long edge. So when I'm lining these up, I'm going to make sure that this edge, my cream edge, is matching, and this is probably going to hang out on the one side just a little bit more. On the other side it should match because I got my seam allowance wide enough. So that's another step in my compensation for not having my flying geese exactly the right size. Now I said make 2 of these, but you might as well make 4, because your next step is to make another row or 2 more rows of them, and you're going to, on those 2 rows, add your little squares that you had left to the ends. So I'm going to do that, but I'm also going to do something else before I come back. So I'm going to add these guys to opposite sides of my center. These points, you do want them lined up, but since this one is more than 1/4 of a way and that one's 1/4 of an inch, just get them lined up. You're going to have some space right here. And remember, I am compensating on these guys. So over here I have my full seam allowance. Here I don't. So when I put this on here, I'm going to line up. This end has the full seam allowance. I'm going to line up, and you can see there's a little bit of a gap right there. I want it there. I don't want to run the fabric right up to the edge because my red isn't a full 1/4 of an inch. I forgot to say, I pressed these out toward the half square units on the ends. Okay, I sewed the shorter rows to the top and bottom, and I pressed in toward the square and square unit. And the points aren't exact, but there's so much bulk here when it turns that it looks pretty good. I sewed my squares onto the end of my sawtooth, basically that's what it is, strip, and I pressed the seams out toward the squares. Now my last step is to sew the longer borders onto this block. Again, I'm compensating here where it's a little bit narrow on my flying geese. I'm trying to line up those points so they're at least perpendicular to each other. And my seams are going opposite directions, so they'll nest here and here. And I am actually sewing on this one, on the part with the flying geese and the half square triangle units, because there are more points here to worry about. Here's the finished union square. After I sewed those last 2 edges on, I again pressed in toward the center. If I hadn't told you that I had to compensate for those flying geese units, I don't think you could tell. It's good enough anyway. This block should measure 8 inches at this point.